This presentation is about adaptive evaluations. Adaptive evaluations developed as a natural complement to the work Imago has been doing for the past 8 years on scaling innovations with grassroots organizations. Imago's implementation work typically involves management techniques, some of which are similar in approach and spirit to implementation strategies such as agile or problem-driven iterative adaptation. Imago's experience is that scaling up involves the transformation of an organization, which is certainly not a linear process and often has unpredictable outcomes. The evaluations we saw were not designed for these types of change processes. An adaptive evaluation is our attempt to design an evaluation that facilitates change processes such as innovation and scaling. So without further ado, I'm going to dive straight into the content. So we have 3 items in the agenda for today. We'll start with the motivation for an adaptive evaluation, then what is an adaptive evaluation, and then finally, a quick summary and conclusion. So we begin with motivation just to see where adaptive evaluations fit the larger evaluation framework. So we think there are 3 broad types of evaluation questions that fairly categorize all evaluation questions. And the first type is descriptive. This is describing the world as it is. They involve generating descriptive statistics. Typical questions include what is the average or percent of Z in the data? In a more qualitative realm, this involves individual views, beliefs, expectations, and ways of being. The second type of evaluation question is technical. These are more complicated questions. They require a lab-like setting to be able to isolate treatment and control. They involve testing a hypothesis on product or intervention design. Occasionally, this involves a few hypotheses, typically with multiple treatment arms, with each treatment arm denoting a different design. Results are typically produced and shared in 2 to 5 years. Typical questions here include, was X intervention effective in causing the desired Y outcomes? And the third type of evaluation question is more adaptive in nature. These are complex questions because they depend on unpredictable and constantly evolving human behavior, systems, and contexts. Lab-like settings are possible, but only in a very few instances. It involves testing several potential hypotheses, not only on product or intervention design, but also on what processes and contexts made the design work. Results are produced and shared in shorter cycles, but also in the longer term. Typical questions include what battery of interventions may lead to the desired outcomes, how does the intervention interact with the system, and what processes and contextual factors cause it to work. And so, just because we're going to use the term adaptive questions in the future as well, adaptive questions are complex in nature. They are subject to human behavior, they interact with systems, and are context dependent. And to be clear, so an evaluation may delve into all 3 types of questions or a combination of the types with varying sequences over time. So you can imagine an evaluation starting with a descriptive question, describing the world as it is, then moving to a technical question, and then moving into the more adaptive space that is more complex. But you can also imagine starting with an adaptive question and then breaking it down, making it simpler, and moving to a more technical question over time. And finally, while we have tried to categorize all evaluation questions in three buckets, there's of course some nuance and some overlap. So an illustration from questions raised by COVID. And we're gonna look at vaccine development as our illustration. So descriptive questions would be, what is the gene sequence? What is the reproduction rate, commonly known as R0, or how were vaccines developed in the past? Now, it's important to note that these are extremely important questions, and it's really the first step in any investigation of vaccines. And so it's really the stepping stone and the foundation from which any evaluation would have to be built. So these questions are fundamental and extremely important. A technical question would be, is the vaccine candidate effective. Now, this of course refers to all the trials by Pfizer, by Moderna, by Johnson and Johnson, all of which looked at efficacy of different candidates to show whether they can be used um, effectively and combat the virus. So again, needless to say, these technical questions are very, very important in any sort of evaluation of vaccine development. But they're also adaptive questions. So one adaptive question is, how can we improve upon the current vaccine solutions? And this is really a question about that at its heart is about innovation. It's about research and development. It's about coming up with novel solutions and iterating towards a design that works and is most effective. Um, so that's the first. The second question is how to distribute the vaccine effectively. And this is adaptive because it deals with unpredictable and changing systems. It relates to supply chains, supply chains in the state, supply chains locally, but also global supply chains and how to distribute the vaccine. And finally, the third adaptive question listed here is how to increase take-up of the vaccine. And it's adaptive because it deals with unpredictable human behavior. At the heart of this question is perceptions around the vaccine and beliefs around vaccines. And how these perceptions and beliefs can be easily influenced, um, and so on and so forth. And so different kinds of questions require different tools. So descriptive questions, it involves descriptive data analysis, it involves benchmarking, comparisons with other countries or other geographical units, desk research to understand the history of vaccines, how were vaccines developed in the past, and increasingly in COVID, there was demand for real-time data collection given the urgency and the need to act fast. Technical questions, what is typically used is a randomized control trial, or in case you can't randomize, you use quasi-experiments. This would be regression discontinuity design or instrumental variables, or propensity score matching, and so on and so forth. But when we come to adaptive questions, the range of techniques used to answer adaptive questions are not always obvious or known. Worse, what frequently happens is evaluation techniques for technical questions, such as an RCT, are overused to answer questions that are adaptive in nature. And therein lies the fundamental problem. Evidence from RCTs answer technical questions, but are not always best suited for adaptive questions. And yet, we use RCT or quasi-experimental evidence in many adaptive solutions. The rest of the talk will focus on adaptive questions. These are important questions, equally important questions, especially from the purview of policy. COVID-19 is, of course, just an illustrative example of the importance of adaptive questions, especially when one needs to act fast and in which the environment is uncertain and the context is shifting. But we can imagine these in many, many policy contexts. And Imago, in its work in scaling and innovation, tends to frequently encounter adaptive questions. And hence, we developed a strategy to deal with these very situations. And so, the rest of the talk is really about demystifying and putting techniques to try and answer adaptive questions. So what is an adaptive evaluation? It's really very simply a set of techniques to answer adaptive questions. And as a reminder, adaptive questions are complex in that they depend on unpredictable and evolving human behavior, systems, and contexts. They're rarely conducive to lab-like settings in which we can have a clean treatment group and control group. They involve testing multiple hypotheses, not only on product intervention and design, but also on what processes and contexts made the design work. And finally, they typically need to be answered in a shorter time frame. And so there are four main kinds of adaptive questions that are addressed in adaptive evaluations. The first type of question is on theory of change. And so here we ask what intervention or what battery of interventions may lead to the desired outcomes. And you can imagine many possible interventions that lead to the desired outcome. But then you ask what expected causal mechanisms would allow these interventions to reach the desired outcomes. And what are the unintended consequences of the intervention? And finally, when we have many interventions trying to redress or a certain problem or say alleviate poverty, how do these interventions interact with each other? Are there negative spillovers or consequences of having more than one intervention attacking the same problem? Or is there an argument for convergence or combining some of these interventions? And so that's in the realm of the theory of change. The second category of questions deal with systems. And here we ask, who are the main stakeholders? How do they interact with each other? What are their reciprocal obligations to each other? And in sort of mapping this out, we can ask ourselves, what are enablers and resistors to change? Where are roadblocks and blockages? But where are places where we can intervene? Uh, Finally, one important question when doing a system diagnostic is, what is the minimum capacity and quality required at each step in the system to ensure the outcome? And what processes are in place to ensure the outcome is delivered? And finally, looking at the system as a whole, what is the cost to the system in terms of return on investment or social return on investment? And is the intervention cost effective? The third category of adaptive questions are those relating to optimal design or proof of concept. And here it's really about learning and continuous learning to try and get to a product or intervention design that has more improved performance. So of course, the question here is about what is the optimal design of the intervention and what are optimal processes to make it work, but also what standard operating procedures can be best scaled. Um, and finally, there's questions on impact and effectiveness. And while other types of evaluations also have questions on impact and effectiveness, this is really in the purview of complex settings, which, with unpredictable behavior, contexts, and systems. And in these contexts, you also want to know, did the intervention work? What part of the intervention worked? What channels were effective? For whom did it work? And in what context did it work? And so the elements of an adaptive evaluation are designed to address these different types of adaptive questions. The first type element is theory-based approaches. They try to unpack the black box between the intervention and the outcome. And typically you do many theories of change for different interventions that affect the outcome. It allows engaging with several interventions, hypotheses, and their interactions. And so the question this addresses, of course, is the theory of change question. And techniques involve building a theory of change. And by that, we mean a log frame that, has several steps between the intervention and the outcome. And this is done usually using Ishikawa or fishbone diagrams. And the steps are informed by literature, by theories on how change happens. Second, we have system-based approaches. They identify key members relevant to the intervention and their interrelationships. It results in an understanding of the demands of an intervention in the system. It also helps identifying resistors, but also enablers of change. And you can, think of levers or where we can intervene in the best way possible. The question type is, of course, system diagnostic. And here you do a system mapping exercise. Sometimes, to understand organizations within a system, we at Imago use something called FLAME. FLAME is an organizational effectiveness tool. It tries to look at, this misalignment that sometimes exists between the actions and structures of an organization and the tone and identity. Sometimes here at Imago, we also use the scaling up framework developed by Isabel Guerrero, who's also our founder. Iterative approaches is the third element and is really central to adaptive evaluation. It's also where adaptive evaluations gets its name from, because it involves continuous learning and adapting. So this involves rapid prototyping, experimentation, and measurement in short sprints. It enables testing multiple designs and actively learning to improve these designs. And here the goal is, of course, to answer questions on optimal design and proof of concept and slowly converge towards a design that works. There are a host of techniques here, some of which are listed. So there's A/B testing, there's beneficiary interviews, looking at uh, the beneficiary of a policy and program and asking them what they would like, what they need, what they want, and using that to design the product. You can also do user journeys, which is following a user and understanding roadblocks uh, that come on their path. And finally, this is an overarching approach. The overarching element that is that it is mixed method. And by mixed method, we mean it involves the use of quantitative and qualitative evidence. This makes an evaluation more amenable to shifting contexts and more robust to measurement errors. And when we say quantitative and qualitative, we mean, using them side by side, allowing quantitative evidence to inform qualitative deep dives and qualitative evidence to inform quantitative questions. And so this answers questions of impact and effectiveness. And here there's a host of techniques again. So there's RCTs and quasi-experimental designs, but there's also outcome harvesting, which involves collecting or harvesting evidence of what has changed or outcomes usually from stakeholders, and then working backwards to determine whether and how the intervention has contributed to these changes. This is typically a more participatory approach, and it leads to discovering unintended consequences from people that are closest to the problem. There's also process tracing. Process tracing is really a tool that looks to confirm or negate logic statements in the theory of change. So more specifically, it looks at statements to examine whether they're sufficient or necessary for affirming a causal hypothesis and the implications of this on rival hypotheses. So a simple example would be, suppose you want to test if a state guideline on convergence of two large social programs leads to women's empowerment. And so the first question you should ask yourself is, if this causal mechanism was true, if the state guideline did lead to women's empowerment, what else must be true? And so one thing that must be true is that the state guideline is implemented in lower levels of administration and that frontline workers are aware of this guideline. And so one can verify if that's true. So if it is true that the guideline is implemented at lower levels and that frontline workers are aware, it's hard to say whether the state guideline led to women's empowerment, and one can't refute this claim. However, if it's true that the state guideline was not implemented in lower levels and that frontline workers are unaware, then you can definitely reject the causal claim. And so process tracing is really about building statements that can help you identify a causal claim. And finally, there's positive deviance analysis. Of course, this involves looking at outliers, states that performed well and states that didn't, and looking at what makes them different qualitatively. And realist synthesis is the synthesis of wide range of evidence to identify and explore, not only what works, but for whom, and especially in what context. So these are the elements of an adaptive evaluation. And so this is a visual illustration of some of these elements. So theory-based approaches, as we said, try to unpack or demystify the black box between an intervention and outcome. So the first is the fishbone diagram, trying to get at, identifying problems, cause and effect. And there is an Ishikawa diagram below. One thing to note about theory-based approaches is that it is by nature linear. So it linearizes sort of the causation from the intervention to the outcome. This is in contrast to system-based approaches, which are more dynamic in nature. So as you sort of make a system map like one here, you're able to identify positive and negative reinforcing loops, which means, suppose you start at a certain situation, there are certain cycles that can, reinforce uh, negative or positive outcomes. And one good example is a poverty trap. So a poverty trap is an example of a reinforcing loop where because you're poor, you have less access to resources and less income, less investments in health and education, which further leads to poverty. And this reinforcing loop is dynamic. Um, so, in understanding where these loops are and where to intervene, uh, one can learn a lot, not only about the system, but also how to make a policy more effective. Iterative approaches borrow a lot from the private sector and are very common there. So, the first sequence here comes from design thinking of empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. The second comes from agile, the idea of working in sprints where you plan, design, test, develop, deploy, and review. And the overarching, I guess, principles here are really about continuous learning, about iterating and slowly converging to an optimal design by quickly processing information, learning from mistakes, and keeping what works. And finally, like I said, this is an overarching approach, the approach being mixed method. And so a lot of research currently, at least in economics um, and some of the other more quantitative social sciences, used to usually start with qualitative research. You undertake interviews or focus groups to really contextualize and get a sense of the on-the-ground situation and reality. And you use those insights to ask a quantitative question, and then you get insights. There's another kind of research called explanatory research, where a quantitative question and results lead to some puzzles. And while you may have some causal path, you don't understand why it came about and how it came about. And so that leads to a qualitative deep dive and you get insights. But mixed method is more about having qualitative and quantitative work simultaneously. And the insights are really at the intersection of the two. Um, and so again, these are just the elements of an adaptive evaluation. But stepping back, uh, I, I also wanted to, describe a little bit what is the underlying philosophy or principles of an adaptive evaluation. And really, uh, the overarching philosophy is that adaptive evaluations do not presume knowledge and focus on learning. And I guess more specifically, we mean they do not presuppose a hypothesis ex ante, but investigate multiple hypotheses, allowing outcomes to emerge. The second, and this is very important, is that adaptive evaluation uh, transitions from a testing environment in lab-like conditions to understand what works to a learning environment in more dynamic conditions to try and use information, adapt, and improve the intervention design or product. Metaphorically, it is more a systematic algorithm of moving in the darkness as opposed to picking one boat and testing whether it floats or sinks. Finally, an adaptive evaluation is more open-minded with techniques, realizing that tools for technical questions may not always work for adaptive questions. And here, the classic analogy is that of Maslow's hammer. So if the only tool you have is a hammer, it's not advisable to treat everything as if it were a nail. Um, and so what is the process of an adaptive evaluation? And so if we had to put it in one sentence, it would be in-depth analysis of theory, context, and the system, followed by iterations, and then cycles of quantitative and qualitative assessments. And so there are three steps in the process. The first step is scoping the landscape. The next step is innovation. And the last step is scaling. And each of these have a process within it. And so in scoping the landscape, we generally start with a general theory of behavior. And this involves looking into the literature, understanding what are current theories of behavior or theories that explain whatever phenomenon we're working on. So if we're working on women's empowerment, what are the theories of women's empowerment that currently exist? This then moves to more specific theories of behavior that are more grounded in the context, and sometimes this involves state-society interactions. Um, And from there, we do a systems mapping. Again, this is more specific. You identify the stakeholders, hold stakeholder interviews, understand how what obligations they have with each other and how things truly work on the ground, but also what are enablers and resistors to change. And this leads to, with all this information from general theory to specific theory, this informs building a theory of change, uh, including one for each intervention. And finally, this helps fidelity testing, which is getting a sense of what at the moment, what are the interventions at the moment, which are salient, which are not, and also a data assessment of what is available and what needs to be collected. And so from this scoping exercise, some of this also involves understanding sometimes when you enter a context of how we got here, what was done before and what was the history that got us to this point. Um, from that sort of scoping landscape, we move to innovation. And this involves, for a specific intervention and few designs, iterating to until you get to a more optimal sort of design. And so there are many illustrations of this sort of iterative cycle, and this is one from design thinking, which we saw earlier, which is you empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test, and go on and on until you sort of reach to a design that seems optimal. And when you have an optimal design, you want to scale. And in measuring scaling, we the process is to start qualitative work, focus groups, key informants, etc., and use that to inform quantitative survey design and a baseline, more qualitative studies, and then a quantitative midline and endline. And so that in general is the adaptive evaluation process. Finally, we get into applications of an adaptive evaluation, and we think an adaptive evaluation is best suited for innovation and scaling. And so it's important to understand first that innovation and scaling, we think of it as a continuum. And so you can think of, at very close to innovation is an exploratory or prototyping phase. This is when there are theoretically infinite designs or many designs. And so you can test out you can't, because there's so many designs, you test typically at a very small scale, and there's little standardization of design because it's unclear what works, what doesn't. From there, you move to an experimental or piloting phase where at this point you have some designs because in very initial tests you're able to identify what works or what's needed or what's wanted. And so you can test some designs in some larger scale, and there's some standardization of design. And then finally, there's a learning phase, also part of innovation, in which you finally have a few designs. You've narrowed it down to 2 or 3 things that you think should work. You can do it in much more scale. At this point, there's a lot of standardization in design, but little standardization of the processes and the contexts that make it work. And from here, you move into scaling. So in an initial rollout, you'd roll out in India, this would be maybe one block, and you start to work on standardizing processes, experimenting on different processes that would make this work within the system and context. An intermediate rollout, this would involve scaling, so rolling out in a larger geographical denomination. In India, this would be a district. And so for more standardization of process as you narrow down some of the process choices, right? And then from a rollout in a district, you can imagine rollout in one state with even more standardization. And finally, a large scale rollout. So rollout in the country. And at this point, you really have nearly complete standardization of process. And so you can see that from innovation to scaling, there's general scale that increases throughout, the scale at which you can measure and test the designs. But there's also experimentation in both. In the innovation sort of segment, you're experimenting on design, whereas as you scale, you're experimenting still, but you're experimenting on processes, and you're experimenting on how best to adapt to shifting contexts. And so this is the innovation scaling continuum. And as you've discussed, of course, there's a complexity continuum, and you can move from higher to lower complexity. And as we described, higher complexity, we mean relatively unpredictable and constantly evolving human behavior, systems, and contexts. And lower complexity, meaning relatively stable human behavior, systems, and contexts. But what's important to understand is that, these the different complexity in environments has important implications for evaluation. So in higher complexity situations, uh, existing data quality is relatively poor. Data collection in complex settings is difficult, is relatively difficult. Sometimes data sources are scarce, and typically it's more difficult to find a reasonable counterfactual and separate treatment and control. Um, the implications on lower complexity are different. So in this case, existing data quality is relatively high. Data collection is also relatively easy and generated in higher volume with low effort. So, you can do big data analysis or machine learning or time series that tends to take more data. Data sources are also relatively more abundant. And here in less complex settings, it is relatively easier to separate treatment and control and randomize. And so an adaptive evaluation uses different tools depending on the complexity of the context, but also the nature of the task. And so we have the two scales, the complexity scale and the innovation continuum scale and the innovation scaling continuum. And we're going to try and map different techniques onto these two axes. And so we'll start with the first quadrant. This is the quadrant in which we have lower complexity and we're at innovation. At very early stages of innovation, when there are many untested design options and we're in a low complexity environment, we can use A/B testing. And here you can think of app development or think of an app to increase entitlements uh, to state benefits for relatively poor people. And so here, what you could do is have deploy an app with certain features on one set of population and an app with different features on another, and randomize. But as we have much more refinement in design and that we're at a more advanced stage in innovation in which we have narrowed it down to say 2 or 3 choices, we can use more developed RCTs. And typically with much more data collection on participant characteristics and process monitoring implemented at a larger scale than the first pilots. RCTs can handle more complexity than A/B testing and are usually conducted in many social experiments. And so let's move to the second quadrant. This is where we have high complexity, but we're still at an innovation phase. At very, very early stages of innovation, when there are many possibilities, and when complexity is very high, one can run simulations based on models. And a good example here is macro policy, often uses models, their assumptions on human behavior, such as rational expectations, for example. There's assumptions on inputs, on the level of risk aversion in some macro models, but also on levels of other macroeconomic variables. And so simulations is really useful for high complexity and early stages of innovation. At a slightly more advanced stage of innovation, you can ask beneficiaries and use empathy maps to really understand the user, what is needed, what is required, to narrow down design choices. And once we have more of a running minimum viable product, we can consider user journeys. At a stage when the intervention is more mature, but we're still at the innovation stage, we can use process tracing and monitoring of key outcomes or metrics. In the third quadrant, we now are finally into scaling and at a lower complexity. So scaling in a lower complexity, and you can think of maybe expanding the teaching at the right level program, say to at the state level, or maybe distributing bed nets to school children in a period of economic, social, or political stability. And here, for early stage rollouts, say in the block or district level, one can use an RCT for maybe more higher for a higher level of scaling, say at the state level. And here you can think of state policy for minimum wage in relatively stable economic conditions. One can think of a spatial discontinuity design, like using geographical boundaries as the discontinuity. And you can even think of, as you scale more, quasi-experimental methods, um, if they're comparator cases without the new scaled intervention. And finally, let's look at the fourth quadrant. A good example here is vaccine distribution during COVID. And this, in many ways, is the most challenging to think about, but this is also a space where many adaptive questions inhabit. It's and so let's start at a very high level of complexity. So to the far right, and at a large scale state or national rollout. In this space, one can imagine a variety of eclectic qualitative techniques, from case studies and positive deviance analysis to process and systems mapping, flame and appreciative inquiry, and realist synthesis and outcome harvesting. As we reduce the complexity a bit, but still remain at a very large scale of the rollout, we can again use monitoring, but this time of state level indicators at even lower levels of complexity, but at large scale rollout, we can imagine interrupted time series. You can also imagine natural experiments. And finally, if we're at early stage rollouts, but in very, very complex environments, we can conduct a needs assessment to understand the resources needed to scale and also process tracing of system behavior. And so these are, of course, just one, this is just, these are just, this is just a mapping of a few techniques on this sort of space between innovation and scaling and complexity. But the idea is, different levels of complexity and different natures of tasks require different techniques. And of course, there are trade-offs as one moves across innovation, scaling, and the complexity space. So as you move to the right, you'll notice the techniques have less causal attribution, but as you move to the left, there's more causal attribution. As you move up, there are more granular measurements that are more accurate and specific, say, to the individual. And as you move up, techniques are designed to measure efficacy of intervention design for a particular context. But as you move down, it becomes less granular, it becomes more summarized, it becomes averages and averages of averages, and aggregations. But also techniques designed to measure the techniques are more designed to measure the ability to adapt to different contexts. And it's also designed to measure more processes. And so an evaluation can follow many different paths over time. And what here I mean is you can think of any evaluation as being at a given point, at any given point, an evaluation is at a certain point in innovation and scaling and at a certain level of complexity. And over time, their position in the innovation scaling and complexity sort of space changes. And so in ordinary circumstances, with no extraneous shocks or disruptions, an intervention can move from innovation to scaling for a given level of complexity over time. And that's path one here. So the level of complexity remained constant and the intervention moved from innovation to scaling. But occasionally, the environment becomes more complex with time, say because we're moving into a recession or entering a pandemic or entering, a war-like situation. And so one can imagine moving diagonally and downwards to the right across the diagram, and that's path two. In other situations, you can imagine the environment becomes less complex, because, for example, data systems have improved. And so you can imagine moving diagonally into the left, and that's path three. And most often, evaluations are messy. So, you start at a certain point, you zigzag, sometimes you move from innovation to scaling and then have to start with innovation again as the environment changes. And of course, these are illustrations of some paths, and that's path four, but you can imagine infinite possible paths, and you don't have to start from innovation and all the way to scaling. Sometimes you're just working on scaling, and the environment change. But I think this is important because it highlights a very important aspect of adaptive evaluation, and that is adaptation. So as you move, as you know, context and environment changes, it's important to adapt techniques to match the environment. And so as you're moving along different paths, it's important to use techniques that fit the complexity, but also the level you are in innovation and scaling. Um, and so with that, we move to our last segment. And so in summary, as we discussed, there is a difference between evaluating technical questions and evaluating adaptive questions. And of course, an evaluation, as we discussed earlier, could, at in different sequences be evaluating technical and adaptive questions. And we see these as complements rather than substitutes, but it's important to distinguish how they're different. So in evaluating technical questions, the objective is precise testing of specific hypotheses or sometimes a few hypotheses pertaining to the intervention with conditions remaining the same, or ceteris paribus. But evaluating adaptive questions involves continuous learning by assessing multiple interventions and several potential hypotheses in dynamic environments. As you said, the environments, technical questions reside in a setting in which one can separate treatment and control, whereas adaptive questions, reside in a complex setting, which is unpredictable and has constantly evolving human behavior, systems, and contexts. And the philosophy is also different. So in technical questions, you specify hypotheses and outcomes ex ante. Um, in adaptive questions, you allow hypotheses and outcomes to emerge, and hypotheses and outcomes are determined jointly with beneficiaries and stakeholders. And this is important because many times the values of the evaluator and the values of the implementing organization are very different. And so to understand the different values and different objectives is very important in making progress. Questions, as we discussed, are technical questions and are technical and one are adaptive. The approach is, typically in technical questions is randomized or quasi experiments. In adaptive questions, we have approaches, theory-based, system-based, iterative, and mixed, some of which can involve an RCT. If you're in a low complexity sort of setting, in an initial rollout, or in some sort of innovation stage, you can use an RCT. But in other situations, when you're in higher complexity, and you're in innovation or scaling, you may have to use other methods. Techniques, we have discussed the techniques, but in technical questions, you sort of favor techniques that have more causal attribution. Whereas adaptive questions, there's more methodological flexibility, open-mindedness to a variety of techniques. There's some emphasis on external validity, but only when scaling. Applications, so typically in a technical evaluation of a technical question leads to an impact assessment, whereas evaluating adaptive questions deal with situations of innovation and scaling. There's some difference in positioning too. So when you're evaluating a technical question, you are almost an independent and objective outsider. You attempt to observe and document what the intervention team does while being careful not to influence them. Whereas while evaluating adaptive questions, you're an internal evaluation unit. You're embedded deeply within the system and integrated with the process, design, improvement, and scaling of the program. And finally, reporting is different. So technical questions, are formal academic papers, whereas adaptive questions, it's periodic feedback and user-friendly learning reports for the organization, published more frequently. And so in conclusion, what is an adaptive evaluation? As we discussed, it's just a set of techniques to answer complex adaptive questions that deal with unpredictable human behavior, systems, and contexts. Why adaptive evaluations? It's because evaluation tools for technical questions are frequently used in adaptive questions. And so we need a new strategy and framework to deal with them. Why now? Because development has shown us time and time again that solutions need to adapt to the nature of the problem and the unique context from which it arises. And solutions in one setting are rarely valid in another, and often, many times, solutions are closest to those who are facing the problem on the ground. When is it best to use an adaptive evaluation? Typically, best used in for scaling and in scaling up and innovation. And how does it work? It involves three phases: scoping the landscape, innovation, and scaling, and four broad approaches: theory-based, system-based, iterative, and mixed method approaches. And so that is the end of this presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and hope this provided some food for thought. Thank you very much.